our enthusiasm for Helen's work goes beyond a shared interest in public schools, a commitment to inclusivity, and many other issues of concern. I have to say, hasn't Helen done the most spectacular job being visible during her first term on City Council? So I was saying this to Helen the other day. I said, I think all of these veteran members of City Council have a lot to learn from you in this regard, but it's not just in service to what I expect will be Helen's successful re-election campaign, but I believe this kind of positive visibility from our elected leaders can actually help restore our faith in government. I think there's been a real destruction of the faith many Americans have in the efficacy of government, and I just applaud your work, the substance and the PR aspects of it, because I think it's really tremendous, and I think we can do more if we perceive our leaders as being effective. So I'd like to turn my attention now, of course, to Kim Roosevelt. I'll offer a little bit of translation. Kermit Roosevelt, to my left. Kim Roosevelt is how I've always known him. My wife Angela and Kim were undergraduates together years ago at Harvard. I think both at Dunster House, is that?
I was in Winthrop House.
You were in Winthrop House, but there was some kind of neighbors. Okay, well, so there's a very tonight, and we Kim and his family have been incredibly generous to our family. I just like to say that, last summer Amanda got a house sitting gig as a result of Kim. Kim and Felicia were really generous in a book my wife recently wrote. And I'd have to say Felicia, Kim's wife, has recruited us to be part of Circle Compost. And I can't recommend it enough. It's been terrific. I hope you will consider it. So we've been truly beneficiaries of their brilliance, their conscience, and their kindness as neighbors. So now, of course, in the age of Donald Trump, we all need to really turn to Kim for his expertise in the Constitution and the constraints that it places upon our elected leaders. So let me tell you a little bit about Kim's expertise. Kermit Roosevelt is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice David Souter. His novels include Allegiance and In the Shadow of the Law, and his nonfiction work includes The Myth of Judicial Activism, Making Sense of Supreme Court Decisions, and Conflict of Laws. Professor Roosevelt's law review articles have been cited twice by the Supreme Court. He is a graduate of Harvard and Yale Law School. Please welcome Kim Roosevelt.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Helen, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Happy to see so many familiar faces. I really love our neighborhood. I love our neighborhood association. I think it's great the way we can get together and do things and have a positive impact with sort of organization at the local level. So Helen wanted me to talk just briefly about the Constitution and courts as a constraint on government, and also sort of the role of social movements. And so I tried to put all of that together. And basically the big theme of it was how to avoid injustice in a democracy. And more particularly in America, and most particularly in America right now. But I was going to start a little bit more broadly. So the discussion in our system of government should really start with the president, because the president is responsible for most of what the federal government does. The president is the one who initiates most of these actions. So there's your first line of defense. If you've got a good president, and the president exercises good leadership, then he or she can protect you. But, of course, the president is just one person, and you can get a bad president. And the founders, the people who wrote the Constitution, knew that. So we tend, I think, a lot of the time to overestimate what the founders knew. We think that the founders had the answers to whether regulation of violent video games is consistent with the First Amendment or something, which, of course, they didn't. But the problem of the bad president, this was something that they foresaw, and they tried to handle it. They tried to deal with it by giving us separation of powers. So the Constitution separates the powers of the federal government into three different branches. The executive branch, which is the president, the legislative branch, which is Congress, and the courts, the judiciary. And they separated power in order to protect the people. The idea being that if a bad actor takes over one branch, the others are supposed to step up and check him. So hypothetically, if you've got a bad president, you would expect Congress to step up and check that person. Shifting to the real world, you might expect Congress to investigate the president's connections to Russia, or something like that. Right? You might expect Congress to do something like what the Republican Congress did to Obama for years and years, to stymie his projects, or what they did to Hillary, to investigate over and over again. But in fact, in the real world, you're not getting any of that. And that's because there's something that the founders didn't anticipate, which is the party system. And the party system really wrecks separation of powers. Because the idea behind separation of powers is the members of each branch will feel a sense of loyalty to their institution. And they'll try to protect its authority and resist incursion by the other branches. And this is what you could call institutional loyalty. So the idea is the members of Congress, they look to the president, they see a rival, they see potentially a threat. And if the president tries to expand his authority, does questionable things, members of Congress will be right up there pushing back. In our world, this doesn't really happen because party loyalty trumps institutional loyalty. So if the president is from the same party as a member of Congress, that member of Congress looks at the president and doesn't see a rival. They see basically the captain of their team. And they're not interested in checking that person. They're interested in helping that person, making them look good, covering up their mistakes and misdeeds, maybe. Conversely, if the member of Congress is from a different political party, they look at the president and they see sort of the captain of the other team. And they want to make that person fail. They want to deny that person accomplishments so that their party can take back the presidency in 4 years. So it turns out you can't really rely on Congress, because Congress is going to be motivated by partisan considerations. But luckily there's another branch of government, which is the courts. So you can also look to the courts. And here it turns out you get a little bit more in terms of checks and balances, because the federal courts, especially the Supreme Court, are inherently conservative. And I mean that not in a liberal conservative sort of way, but in a resist change sort of way. So federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court, tend to represent the political consensus of about 10 years ago. Because the turnover for Supreme Court justices is very slow. It's very hard for a new political movement to come along and capture the Supreme Court in the way it could capture the presidency or Congress. One president really is not going to be able to do it. The president's there for 8 years at the most, not going to be able to appoint enough justices. FDR, who was president for 12 years, actually did capture the Supreme Court. He appointed 8 justices. But that's not going to happen again. So if you're wondering what Trump can do to the Supreme Court, and people ask this, the answer is he can shift it along the liberal-conservative axis, where it's relatively evenly balanced now. He can make it more conservative. But he can't make it a Trumpist court, if you assume that that's even a coherent political ideology, which I don't think it is. But to do that, he would have to replace 5 justices, and he's not going to do that. So you can expect courts to push back against aggressive executive action, and historically that's what they've done, although not always very successfully. If you look back, for instance, to FDR's presidency, you see the court backing down, first in the face of the New Deal, and then also in the case of the detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. So that's 120,000 people, mostly birthright American citizens, forced out of their homes, forced to leave their states of residence, confined in camps in the interior of the country. Supreme Court didn't interfere. And that's actually the sort of thing that people are more concerned about now, deprivation of civil liberties in the name of national security. So if you're looking at World War II and the Korematsu case, where the Supreme Court said removing the Japanese Americans from the West Coast is okay, you might think you can't really trust the courts to stand up to the president either. And there's actually some truth to that. But if, on the other hand, you look at the post-September 11th Supreme Court litigation about individual liberty and national security, George Bush, interestingly, does a lot worse at the Supreme Court than FDR did, even though some of the things that he was trying to do were very similar to things that FDR did. So why is that? Well, one answer is that the Supreme Court learns from its mistakes. The justices look back on Korematsu and they think, we got that wrong. We were too trusting of the government. We were too deferential to claims that the executive branch made about the needs of national security. But part of the reason they think that when they look back is that in the intervening years, public opinion changed. So the detention of the Japanese Americans was actually very popular at the time. There was a lot of public support. But it got less popular as the years went by. People started realizing it wasn't necessary. People started realizing it was driven by racism, economic opportunism. So there was a social movement, and it changed people's minds, and that changes the way the decision looks to the court when it looks back. And the other reason that Bush did so much worse than FDR is sort of related. It's that there was more popular opposition to his policies at the time they were enacted. So Guantanamo detention, military tribunals, indefinite detention of American citizens without trial, all those things were resisted. And that popular opposition emboldens the courts. So if you had had people protesting the Japanese American detention, if they'd been out there at the camps, if they had been there when the trucks and trains were taking people away, the way that Americans went out to the airports following Trump's immigration order, the Japanese American cases might have come out differently. So courts can stop bad change from happening, although they do it much better if they have popular support. You might also wonder, what about good change? What about if we want to move forward? And there you might say, again, we look to federal courts. So decisions like Brown v. Board of Education, desegregating public schools, or Logan against Virginia, striking down bans on interracial marriage, or most recently, Obergefell against Hodges, recognizing a right to same-sex marriage. Federal courts are leading the way, except they're actually not. Because what the courts are doing in all of those decisions is they're following social movements. They're following activists who change people's minds about the demands of equality, about who it's okay to treat differently, and who's entitled to the same rights and benefits that everyone else enjoys. So for each of those decisions where the court recognizes an equality claim, where it advances equality, there's an earlier decision where they did the opposite, where they said, no, you're not included, you're not the same, you're not entitled to equal rights. And what happens between the decision that rejects the equality claim and the decision that accepts it is always the same thing. It's a social movement that makes moral arguments, not even legal arguments, but moral arguments about who deserves equal treatment. So what that means is there's no bright line distinction between law and morality, or law and politics. Instead, in the area of these Supreme Court decisions, we have what you could call constitutional politics. So the American people argue about the meaning of certain moral commitments in the Constitution, the meaning of equality, the meaning of liberty, and the application of those principles to certain contexts. And then the decisions that courts make are very dependent on the outcome of those arguments. So we, the people, really do have the last word in some ways. We shape the legal world that we live in. We shape the Constitution. And we do that by social activism at the national level or at the local level. And even if you don't have a good president, you can do a lot with good leaders at the local level. And that's why I'm happy to be here, because that's what Helen is such a great example of. Good leadership, good organization, working for good. Thank you.